Hello and welcome. It's good of you to join me. I'm Alex, and this is Canonball, a podcast where we talk about the European literary canon and the history, culture, philosophy, art, and science that surrounds it. You can find a list of what I'll be reading each week throughout 2023 at vollrathpublishing.com. That's VOLLRATH publishing.com. Over the next hour, we will be exploring this week's reading, which is a piece of writing called Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Sextus Empiricus, and since very little is known about his life, we will mostly be looking at passages from this text and thinking about how we can apply it in our lives. Though we cannot meet and speak with these great men of the past, we can still access their writings, into which they put the maximum of their thought and care, and which constitute a great cultural treasure. In studying their writings, we are not simply reading passages out of a book. We are making direct, if one-way, contact with some of the great minds of history, and being enriched by the contact, which is an excellent way to spend an hour. Sextus Empiricus was born in the 2nd century and died either in the late 2nd century or in the early 3rd century. His first name, Sextus, means sixth in Latin, which may mean that he was the 6th child in his family. He was Greek, worked as a physician, and had Roman citizenship. It is not known where he was born, where he lived, or where he died, though any of the three of those may have been Athens, Rome, or Alexandria. I'm delighted to be able to tell you today about this text, which is one item on a short list of writings that have affected my thinking and my life the most of everything I've read so far. If I were to die suddenly, without doing much more than record this podcast, and if I had the luxury of having any final thoughts, among them might well be, at least I made that recording talking about Empiricus's views of skepticism, so maybe a few more people could learn about them. Of the 52 writings I plan to discuss this year, there are only 2 that I have read before. I included these 2 because though on this podcast I'm trying to talk about the new things that I'm reading, these 2 have been so beneficial to me that to not take the opportunity to present them to others in an organized way would be somehow immoral. The other one of the 2, which we will study in a few weeks, is a treatise by René Descartes. The ideas in Empiricus's writings are unlikely to be entirely foreign to most readers. What is significant about them is that they set a clear and high standard by which we can try to evaluate what we think we know. And though, as I mentioned, I had read this text before, I read it again in preparing this podcast to determine what portions of it I should show you. So don't worry, making this recording still took a lot of work. The first time I read this book, I brought it as my reading material on an 11-hour flight about 3 years ago, right before the pandemic broke out. Having started reading about a half hour into the flight, I read the first few pages and had to pause because I realized I had found something significant. I had a feeling as though I had been wandering in a forest for the past decade and that a lantern had suddenly illuminated the game that I had been only vaguely aware that I was hunting. I read from an edition published by Hackett Publishing, translated from Greek by Sanford Etheridge, who died in 2013. Empiricus opens in his characteristic, straightforward manner. His writing is clear and direct. In this passage, he mentions 2 philosophers, Carneades, a Greek philosopher of the 2nd century BC, who, among other things, critiqued the Stoics and the Epicureans, and Clitomachus, a student of Carneades who was an academic skeptic. Neither man left any writings. We will see a bit later what Empiricus means when he says dogmatists. Empiricus writes, quote, "It is a fair presumption that when people search for a thing, the result will be either its discovery, confession of non-discovery and its non-apprehensibility, or perseverance in the search. Perhaps this is the reason why in matters of philosophical research some claim to have discovered the truth, while others declare that finding it is an impossibility, and others are still seeking it. There are some who think that they have found the truth, such as Aristotle, Epicurus, the Stoics, and certain others. These are, in a special sense of the term, the so-called dogmatists. Clitomachus and Carneades, on the other hand, and other academics claim it is a search for inapprehensibles, but the skeptics go on searching. It is therefore a reasonable inference that basically there are 3 philosophies: the dogmatic, the academic, and the skeptic. For the present, our task will be to present an outline of the skeptic discipline, leaving it to such others as befits to treat of the former two. We declare at the outset that we do not make any positive assertion that anything we shall say is wholly as we affirm it to be. We merely report accurately on each thing as our impressions of it are at the moment." End quote. In explaining the etymology of the name of the skeptic philosophy, he gives several Greek alternatives, all of which are worth remembering. Though the word skeptic comes from the Greek skepsis, which is the word for doubt and inquiry, he refers to the zetetic, or searching, the ephetic, or suspending, the aporetic, or doubting, and the Pyrrhonian. Quote, "Because Pyrrho appears to us to have applied himself to skepticism more thoroughly and with more distinction than his predecessors." End quote. Pyrrho was a philosopher of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, credited with being the first skeptic philosopher. And his school of thinking, which rejects dogma and advocates the suspension of judgment over the truth of all beliefs, is named after him. Pyrrho's philosophy is best known through Empiricus's surviving writings, and Pyrrhonism, as a continuing doctrine, was actually established in the 1st century BC, 2 centuries after Pyrrho's death, by Anicedemus, who revived his teachings and introduced 10 skeptical modes for the suspension of judgment. These are likely the same 10 modes that Empiricus discusses in this text. On the purpose of skepticism, Empiricus writes, quote, "Skepticism has its inception and cause, we say, in the hope of attaining mental tranquility. Men of noble nature had been disturbed at the irregularity in things, and puzzled as to where they should place their belief. Thus they were led on to investigate both truth and falsehood in things, in order that, when truth and falsehood were determined, they might attain tranquility of mind." Now, the principle fundamental to the existence of skepticism is the proposition, "To every argument, an equal argument is opposed. For we believe that it is in consequence of this principle that we are brought to a point where we cease to dogmatize." End quote. This gives a glimpse of the central ideas of skepticism, which we will look at momentarily. There is, I think, the way in which Empiricus probably truly meant it, which is oriented around the idea that true knowledge of any subject may or may not be impossible, and the most logical action in the face of uncertain knowledge is to suspend judgment. That is, to neither assent to nor dissent from a given assertion on a subject, or indeed on almost any subject. It is probably true that humans are largely unable to access ultimate truth. After all, we can only seek truth by means of our imperfect senses, which did not evolve for truth-seeking or even comprehension, and by reason, which has its own flaws. However, too much focus on this thought can lead to a kind of fatalism. If we are unable to know anything for certain, why bother trying? We can, and Empiricus would agree with this, as we will see, get closer to exact knowledge about the way in which things appear, though we may not ever know their true essence. Rather than taking his writings as an excuse to give up the pursuit of truth and real knowledge, to me they clarify in bright letters the odds that anyone who has given his life to the hunt is up against. They demonstrate how the task must be taken seriously and how it is not as simple as it seems. Descartes, as we will see in a few weeks, expands and clarifies this idea further. Answering the question, quote, "Do the skeptics deny appearances?" End quote, Empiricus writes, quote, "Those who say that the skeptics deny appearances seem to me to be ignorant of what we say. As we said above, we do not deny those things which, in accordance with the passivity of our sense impressions, lead us involuntarily to give our assent to them, and these are the appearances. And when we inquire whether an object is such as it appears, we grant the fact of its appearance. Our inquiry is thus not directed at the appearance itself. Rather, it is a question of what is predicated of it, and this is a different thing from investigating the fact of the appearance itself. For example, honey appears to us to have a sweetening quality. This much we concede because it affects us with a sensation of sweetness. The question, however, is whether it is sweet in the absolute sense. Hence, not the appearance is questioned, but that which is predicated of the appearance. Whenever we do expound arguments directly against appearances, we do so not with the intention of denying them, but to point out the hasty judgment of the dogmatists. For if reason is such a rogue as to all but snatch even the appearances from under our very eyes, should we not by all means be wary of it, at least not be hasty to follow it, in the case of things non-evident? end quote. He points out a problem with the ultimate truth of even seemingly clever and convincing arguments, and a reason to suspend judgment even on them. Quote, whenever someone propounds an argument that we are not able to dispose of, we make this reply. Before the birth of the founder of the school to which you belong, this argument of your school was not yet seen to be a sound argument. From the point of view of nature, however, it existed all the while as such. In like manner, it is possible, as far as nature is concerned, that an argument antithetical to the one now set forth by you is in existence, though as yet unknown to us. This being so, the fact that an argument seems valid to us now is not yet a sufficient reason why we must assent to it. End quote. Later, he expands on how skepticism arose as an answer to the problem of many conflicting ideas and how it leads to mental tranquility. Quote, our assertion up to now is that the skeptic's end, where matters of opinion are concerned, is mental tranquility. In the realm of things unavoidable, moderation of feeling is the end. His initial purpose in philosophizing was to pronounce judgment on appearances. He wished to find out which are true and which false, so as to attain mental tranquility. In doing so, he met with contradicting alternatives of equal force. Since he could not decide between them, he withheld judgment. Upon his suspension of judgment there followed by chance mental tranquility in matters of opinion. For the person who entertains the opinion that anything is by nature good or bad is continually disturbed. When he lacks those things which seem to him to be good, he believes he is being pursued, as if by the Furies, by those things which are by nature bad, and pursues what he believes to be the good things. But when he has acquired them, he encounters further perturbations. This is because his elation at the acquisition is unreasonable and immoderate, and also because in his fear of a reversal, all his exertions go to prevent the loss of the things which to him seem good. On the other side, there is the man who leaves undetermined the question of what things are good and bad by nature. He does not exert himself to avoid anything, or to seek after anything, and hence he is in a tranquil state. Nevertheless, we do not suppose the skeptic to be altogether free from disturbance. Rather, we say that when he is disturbed, it is by things which are unavoidable. Certainly, we concede that he is sometimes cold and thirsty, and that he suffers in other such ways. But even here there is a difference. Two circumstances combine to the detriment of the ordinary man. He is hindered both by the feelings themselves, and not less by the fact that he believes these contradictions to be evil by nature. The skeptic, on the other hand, rejects this additional notion that each of these things is evil by nature, and thus he gets off more easily. These, then, are our reasons for saying that the skeptic's end is mental tranquility where matters of opinion are concerned, and moderate feeling in the realm of things unavoidable. Some notable skeptics have, however, added to these a third, suspension of judgment in investigations. End quote. So there he's talking about skepticism as a means to perfect tranquility, as he calls it. And to me, that is a secondary benefit to this mode of thinking. What's more significant is using this for accessing truth. Though the calmness that he describes, that comes both from suspending judgment on a topic, if you're not certain about it, to simply say, I don't know, I suspend judgment, and to wait until more information comes in before you come to a conclusion or make a judgment about it, which is something that we should all do more often. That's a good habit, is to say, I suspend judgment on this issue. He also is talking about the piece that comes from withholding a judgment about whether something is good or bad, which sounds very similar to Buddhism, though the two modes of thinking very likely developed more or less independently. This next passage is the most significant paragraph in the whole text. Quote, we say that the skeptic does not dogmatize, but in saying this, we do not understand the word dogma as some do, in the more general sense of approval of a thing. The skeptic, of course, assents to feelings which derive necessarily from sense impressions. He would not, for example, when feeling warm or cold, say, I believe I am not warm or cold. But some say that dogma is the assent given to one of the non-evident things which form the object of scientific research. It is this meaning of dogma that we have in view when we say that the skeptic does not dogmatize, for concerning non-evident things the Pyrrhonian and philosopher holds no opinion. In fact, he does not even dogmatize when he is uttering the skeptic formula in regard to non-evident things. These formulae, the no more, the I determine nothing, and the others, we shall speak of later. End quote. To examine this passage more closely, we can see that he writes, quote, the skeptic does not dogmatize, end quote, and that dogma is, quote, the assent given to one of the non-evident things. End quote. We can simplify this by combining these two statements and say that the skeptic does not assent to what is not evident. The corollary is that the skeptic assents only to what is evident. This principle, to not assent to what is not evident, is, in my view, the skeptic creed. It is the most important idea that Empiricus puts forward, and it is, in my view, the basis for all truly scientific and careful thought. To try to hold fast to this standard every day in our thoughts and in our speech is a worthwhile and difficult goal, expressed clearly and directly in this short phrase, to not assent to what is not evident. Assent in this case meaning to agree to approve of, or to believe to be true. Evident meaning demonstrated to a particular degree through reason, which, as we have discussed before in this podcast, is drawing conclusions from new or existing information with the intention of seeking the truth, and empirical evidence, which is evidence received through the senses, especially by the observation and documentation of patterns and behavior through experimentation. From all this, we can draw that when he says dogmatist, Empiricus means one who adheres to a dogma, or one who assents to what is not evident. So a dogmatist is anyone who assents to what is not evident. This is what a skeptic does not do. I also really like this notion of a dogma being not only some kind of religious dogma, which is how the word is often used today, but being the assent to any idea, whatever that idea might be, that is not evident. Empiricus then summarizes, before later descending into their depths, the 10 modes of skepticism, as well as 5 additional modes, and then 2 more, that help someone to understand the difficulty in knowing anything. With the older skeptics, the usual teaching is that the modes by which suspension of judgment seems to be brought about are 10 in number, which they also term synonymously arguments and forms. These are as follows. First is that in which suspension is caused by the variation in animals. In the second, it is caused by the differences in human beings. Third, by the differences in the construction of the organs of sense. Fourth, by the circumstances. Fifth, by the positions, distances, and places involved. Sixth, by the admixtures present. Seventh, by the quantities and compounding of the underlying objects. Eighth, by the relativity of things. Ninth, by the frequency or rarity of occurrence. And 10th, by the institutions, customs, laws, mythical beliefs, and dogmatic notions. This order, however, is merely arbitrary. Transcending these are 3 modes: the argument from the subject judging, the argument from the object judged, and that from both. The first 4 modes above are subordinate to the argument from the subject judging, for that which judges is either an animal, or a human being, or a sense, and is in some circumstances or other. The 7th and 10th are referred to the argument from the object judged. The 5th, 6th, 8th, and 9th are referred to the argument from both combined. These 3 modes are in turn referred to the mode of relativity, so that the mode of relativity is the summum genus, while the 3 are its species and the 10 are subordinate. End quote. Discussing the first mode, he says briefly that, quote, the same objects do not produce the same impression in different animals. If, therefore, the sense impressions of animals differ as a consequence of the differences which exist between animals, and we cannot possibly sit in judgment over them, we must of necessity suspend judgment in regard to external objects. We cannot give the preference for our own sense impressions over those of the irrational animals. End quote. This next line is not particularly important, but it reveals a weird thought that existed for a long time about bears, specifically, for some reason. Quote, speaking of animals in general again, some are born alive, as are human beings, some are born as eggs, as are birds, and some are born as unformed flesh, as bears. End quote. I looked into this, and people apparently used to think that bears were born just as a ball of flesh, and their mothers licked them into bear shape. One might have expected Empiricus to notice that he had never seen a ball of bear flesh, and so had never seen any evidence for this idea, and that he ought to suspend judgment on it. But he did not. This is just one example of how difficult it is to hold fast to this level of mental discipline. Giving examples of the high level of cognition of various animals, Empiricus gives an example from the Odyssey. He's talking about dogs when he says, quote, we see that he is brave from the way he defends us, and intelligent too, as Homer also testified when he represented Odysseus as going unrecognized by all the members of his household, and as being recognized only by his dog Argus. End quote. He then says, quote, even though we do not understand the sounds made by the so-called irrational animals, it is not altogether improbable that they do not converse without our understanding them, end quote. All of this is to argue that senses, on which we rely for our understanding of almost anything, alongside our reason, differ from animal to animal. Not all animals perceive things the same way, and we cannot very easily discount that our senses are simply better than those of the other animals. The biological research that has been done in the 18 centuries since Empiricus was writing gives us many examples to add to this list. Dogs are colorblind, cats can see in the dark, moths and bats can hear far higher frequencies than humans can, the turkey vulture can smell carrion from a mile away, the mantis shrimp can see 10 times more color than humans can, including ultraviolet, infrared, and even polarized light. Though we now have devices that can detect light and sound outside of the range of our human senses, and even detect aspects of our environment for the detection of which no human sense exists, the Geiger counter, which detects radioactivity, comes to mind. Even this first mode could rightfully make us doubt the reliability of our senses, on which we base much of our knowledge of the world. Discussing the second mode, Empiricus refers to humors, which is a reference to the theory of the four humors, which was developed in ancient Greece and Rome, and influenced European medicine until the 18th century. The idea was that these four humors of the body, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were in balance in a healthy person, and sicknesses often meant that these humors were out of balance. While this is another example of a non-evident matter to which Empiricus assented, and no longer a favored explanation for human health, we can easily follow what he means in this passage, and the principle still applies. Today we might say that different peoples have different predispositions toward certain foods and health conditions. Empiricus writes, quote, let us make a concession for the sake of the argument and say that human beings are more to be believed than the rational animals. Even so, inasmuch as we differ from one another, we shall find suspension of judgment being brought in. It is said that man is made up of two elements, soul and body. Well, in both of these, we differ from one another. As for the body, we have different figures and constitutional peculiarities. Now, the Scythian's figure is different from that of the Indian, and the difference is due, it is said, to the varying predominance of the humors. And accordingly, as a different humor is predominant in men, their sense impressions also are different, as we showed in the first argument. That is why there is also much difference between them in their choice and avoidance of external things. Thus, the Indian standard of taste is different from that in our country, and the fact that we enjoy different things is indicative of a difference in the sense impressions that we get from the external objects. End quote. Having looked at the problem brought about by the difference between the senses of man and the senses of the other animals, he then points out that even if the discussion is limited only to people, there are even many different sense perceptions among people, and to believe all of them is not possible. He then points out the difficulty in determining whom to believe if one is to believe only some people. Most people are not discouraged by this difficulty and simply choose a person or a group of people whose judgments they trust. People's general indifference on this point does not dislodge the epistemological difficulty that Empiricus articulates here. He writes, quote, if it is because of the differences between men that the same objects affect us differently, then this would be another good reason for bringing in suspension of judgment. We are perhaps able to say what each external object appears to be from our several different points of view, but we are unable to give an account of its true essence, for we shall have to believe either all men or some of them. To believe all would be an impossible undertaking, as we should have to accept contradictory accounts, while if we are to believe some, let them tell us who it is we are supposed to agree with. The Platonist will say Plato, the Epicurean Epicurus, and so on with the others. They cannot decide as between their own factions, and this only serves to bring us around to suspension again. End quote. In discussing the third mode, Empiricus makes a good point regarding anyone who prefers their own judgments to another's. Quote, the dogmatists are a rather conceited class of people, and they say that they must give themselves the preference over other men in the matter of judging things. But we know that their claim is absurd, because they themselves form a party to the disagreement. Furthermore, if they are thus prejudiced in favor of themselves whenever they judge appearances, then they are begging the question before they even begin their judgment, because they are turning the decision over to themselves. Nevertheless, we can arrive at suspension of judgment even when basing the argument on a single man, for instance on the wise man, who is the product of their dreams. End quote. Describing the third mode, he explains how the various senses interpret the same object in different ways, making it impossible to know what the essence of the object is. On one level, this is a kind of grammatical problem. Is there such a thing as the essence of an apple, transcending any describable aspect of it? If so, does it matter what its essence is? All the same, there are certainly cases where something can look pleasant and feel harmful, so it is another reason to be cautious about the reliability of our sense impressions. Quote, "This is the one we called the argument from the differences in the senses, and it is clear at the outset that the senses differ from one another. Take paintings, for example. To the eye, they seem to have hollows and prominences, but certainly not to the sense of touch. Each appearance that we perceive through the senses seems to present itself under many forms. An apple, for instance, seems smooth, fragrant, sweet, and yellow. It is uncertain, however, whether these are really the only qualities it possesses, or whether it is of one quality only, but appears in different forms because the various sense organs are of different construction. It may also be that it has more qualities than are apparent, and that some of them are not perceived by us. Let us imagine a man whose senses of touch, smell, and taste are intact, but who is congenitally deaf and blind. This man will have no idea at all that a thing is visible or audible, but will believe that only those three classes of qualities exist, which he is capable of apprehending. With us, too, it is possible that our apprehension of qualities in the apple is determined by the number of senses we possess. 5 only." End quote. So there he is imagining something that modern science has confirmed, which is that an object could have aspects or traits beyond what our senses could detect. For example, radioactivity. Describing the fourth mode, he explains the difficulties how even within the same species, that is humans, within the same individual, and indeed even regarding the same senses, not the difference among the senses, there is still the problem that the very same senses may return different information at different times. Quote, "This mode, we say, is seen in cases of natural or unnatural states, and states of waking or sleeping, and cases where age, motion, or rest, hating or loving are involved, or where the determining factor is a state of want or satiety, drunkenness, or soberness, in cases of predispositions, or when it is a question of confidence or fear or grief or joy." End quote. Here again, he mentions humors, but we can understand this just to refer to a time when a person is sick. Here he points out that while perceptions change when someone is sick, there is no guarantee that a person's perception is not altered in some way when he is healthy, since that is simply our point of reference and we have nothing to which to compare it, no pure, unaltered state of all things. He writes, quote, "Now one might object that in those whose condition is unnatural, it is the intermingling of certain humors that causes them to get unnatural impressions from the external objects. Our reply to this would be that it is possible that the external objects actually are in reality such as they appear to those who are said to be in an unnatural state, and that since people in a state of good health also have mixed humors, it may be that it is these humors that make the objects appear different to them. For it would be a fabrication to attribute to the humors of sick people a power to change external objects, and to deny this power to the humors of the healthy." End quote. He points out that a person perceives the same stimuli differently at different ages. Quote, "Age also makes a difference. Old men, for example, may think the air is cold, but the same air seems mild to those who are in the prime of life. The same color appears dim to older people, but full to those in their prime. And a sound, likewise, the same, seems fainter to the former, but quite audible to the latter." Now, considering the fact that there are so many discrepancies due to the states we are in, and that men are in different states at different times, it is easy, perhaps, to state the nature of each object as it appears to this or that person, but difficult to say further what its real nature is. End quote. He then gets into a dilemma that is called the criterion problem, or the problem of the criterion, which is a larger problem in philosophy. And this articulation here in Empiricus's writings is the earliest extant documentation of it. Quote, "The discrepancy between such impressions is resolvable on other grounds also. If a person prefers one sense impression to another, and one circumstance to another, he does so either without judging, and without proof, by judging and offering proof. But he cannot do so without judgment and proof, for then he will be discredited. Nor can he do so even with judgment and proof,
for if he judges the impressions, he must at all events use a criterion in judging them. A proof cannot be found without the pre-existence of a true criterion, and a criterion cannot be true either without prior confirmation of the proof. And so, both the criterion and the proof fall into a circular argument in which both are found to be untrustworthy. The fact that each expects confirmation from the other makes both of them equally untrustworthy. It is impossible, then, for a person to give the preference to one sense impression over another. This being so, such a difference in sense impressions as arise from a disparity of states will be irresolvable. As a result, this mode also serves to introduce suspension of judgment regarding the nature of external objects." End quote. Another way to state the criterion problem is that in order to establish a criterion for what we know, we first need an established criterion by which to measure it. But then, of course, in order to have established that criterion, you need a criterion by which to establish it. So it goes back infinitely. The remaining modes are relatively simple. Of the fifth mode, Empiricus writes, quote, "The fifth argument is the one based on positions, distances, and places. Each of these can cause the same objects to appear differently. The same boat appears small and stationary from a distance, and large and moving from close by. And the same tower appears round from afar, but square from nearby. Then there are differences due to the places involved. For example, the light of a lamp appears dim in sunlight, but bright in the dark." End quote. He writes of the sixth, quote, "The sixth mode is the one based on admixtures. By this mode, we conclude that since none of the external objects appears to us singly, but always in conjunction with something else, it is perhaps possible to state the nature of the mixture resulting from the conjunction of the external object and that other thing which we perceive together with it, but we are not able to say what the real nature of the external object is in its unmixed state. That no external object is ever perceived singly, but in all cases together with something else, and that this causes it to have a different appearance for us, I take as evident fact. Skin, for instance, shows a different color according to whether the air is warm or cold." End quote. Of the seventh, he says, quote, "The seventh mode, as we said, is based on the quantities and compounding of the external objects. By their compounding, we mean in general their composition. And it is evident that this mode too obliges us to suspend judgment as regards the nature of things. For example, the fillings from a goat's horn appear white when they are seen by themselves and uncompounded, but when they are compounded, so as to constitute a horn, they appear black. In fact, it seems generally true that even things beneficial to us become harmful through their use in immoderate quantities. Things that seem harmful when taken in an excessive quantity are not injurious in very small quantities." End quote. Of the eighth mode, he says, quote, "The eighth mode is the argument from relativity. By this mode, we conclude that since all things are relative, we shall suspend judgment as to what they are absolutely and in themselves. But there is one qualification we must realize, both here and elsewhere. This is that we employ the word are in place of the word appear, so that what we are saying amounts virtually to this: all things appear to be relative. We shall not be able to say what each object is in its own nature and absolutely, but what it appears to be under the aspect of relativity." End quote. Of the ninth mode, he says, quote, "The mode concerned with frequency or rarity of occurrence, which we said was ninth in order, we expound as follows. The sun is surely a more amazing thing than a comet, but the sun we see constantly, whereas we rarely see a comet. Hence our astonishment at the sight of a comet is such that we may even believe it to be a divine omen, while we are not at all astonished at the sight of the sun. Rare things seem to be valuable. Things familiar to us and easily obtainable, not at all. For example, if we suppose water to be a rare thing, how much more valuable it will appear to us than all the things which are held to be valuable. Or if we ponder the thought of gold simply lying about in large quantities on the ground like stones, to whom shall we suppose it would be so valuable, or so much worth locking up? Since, therefore, according to the frequency or rarity of their occurrence, the same things seem sometimes to be astonishing or valuable, and sometimes not at all so, we conclude that we shall perhaps be able to say that the nature of each of these things appears to be in the context of its frequent or rare occurrence, but that it is not within our power to state the nature of each external object considered purely and simply in itself. And so this mode too causes us to suspend judgment concerning them." End quote. Of the 10th mode, he says, quote, "There is a 10th mode. This one is concerned chiefly with ethics. This is the argument from disciplines, customs, laws, mythical beliefs, and dogmatic notions. A dogmatic notion is acceptance of a thing insofar as the acceptance seems to be confirmed by a line of reasoning or by some proof." End quote. I could not find a single sentence or two that said exactly what the core of this 10th mode was, But it seems like what he's saying is that because laws are different, laws and beliefs and notions and customs and disciplines are different in different places, then you can't base anything on them because they're different and often very different on very important points. What's most interesting about this passage is that he gives several examples of different laws in different countries that are in place at the time, and the way that he says it makes me possibly think that this means that he is in Greece. Maybe he's in Athens, because he says Persians, talking about an external group, and he talks about Romans as an external group. And then he sometimes says we, which if he were not in Greece, he might say, and the Greeks, so and so. But this is not a perfect theory, because he might also talk about the Romans being a Roman himself. If you're American, you might sometimes say, just however you were speaking at that moment, you might sometimes say, and Americans do this, while you yourself are an American. But anyway, he gives 3 interesting examples of laws at the time. The first one is, quote, with Persian men, it is a custom to indulge in homosexual practices, while with the Romans, this practice is prohibited by law. End quote. Another one he gives is, quote, Aristippus thinks that dressing in women's clothes is a matter of indifference, whereas we consider this a shameful thing. End quote. And the last one, quote, we oppose law to mythical belief when the poets portray the gods as committing adultery and practicing pederasty, whereas with us these practices are forbidden by law. End quote. He then explains 5 more modes that were added later. Quote, the later skeptics, however, teach 5 modes of suspension. These are the following. The first is based on disagreement. The second is that which produces to infinity. Third, that based on relativity. Fourth, that from assumption. And fifth, the argument in a circle. End quote. He then reviews each briefly. Quote, that based on disagreement is the one in which we find that in regard to a proposed matter, there has arisen in the opinions both of people at large and of the philosophers an unresolved dissension. The mode based on the extension to infinity is the one in which we say that the proof offered for the verification of a proposed matter requires a further verification, and this one another, and so on to infinity, so that since we lack a point of departure for our reasoning, the consequence is suspension of judgment. That based on relativity is that in which, just as we have already said, the object appears thus or thus in relation to the thing judged, and the things perceived along with it, while as to its true nature, we suspend judgment. The mode from assumption exists when the dogmatists, in their regressus ad infinitum, take as their point of departure a proposition which they do not establish by reasoning, but simply, without proof, assume as conceded to them. The mode argument in a circle arises when that which ought itself to be confirmatory of the matter under investigation requires verification from the thing being investigated. At that point, being unable to take either of them to establish the other, we suspend judgment about both. End quote. At one point, he describes the difficulty in assuming anything. Quote, if a person is worthy of credence when he makes an assumption, then we shall in each case also be not less worthy of credence if we make the opposite assumption. End quote. Of the 5 modes, he says, quote, their purpose in setting them forth is not to repudiate the 10 modes, but to provide for a more diversified exposure of the rashness of the dogmatists by combining these modes with the others. End quote. Then finally he lists 2 more modes of suspension. Quote, they also teach 2 other modes of suspension. Since everything apprehended seems to be apprehended either through itself or through something else, they show us that nothing is apprehended either through itself or through another thing, thus introducing, as they think, doubt about all things. That nothing is apprehended through itself is clear, they say, from the disagreement existing among the physicists regarding, I believe, all sensibles and intelligibles. For if that through which something is apprehended must itself have always been apprehended through another thing, we fall into the mode of circular reasoning, or into the mode of infinity. End quote. So in reviewing the growth of this philosophy, that is, in outlining Pyrrhonism, he lists 10 modes, then 5 more, then 2 more after that. He then lists 8 modes for refuting the etiologists, as taught by Anicedemus. Etiology is the study of causation. Empiricus writes, quote, just as we teach the modes of suspension of judgment, in like manner some skeptics set forth modes which enable us to raise difficulties about the particular etiologies of the dogmatists, and thus check them in their inordinate pride in these etiologies. Thus, Anicedemus teaches 8 modes by which he believes he can refute and declare fallacious every etiology of the dogmatists. According to the first of these, he says, etiology in general, because of its involvement in unseen things, derives no confirmation from appearances,
none at least about which there is agreement. The second is the frequent propensity of some to limit themselves to only one theory of causation for the thing in question, although there may be abundant opportunity to account for it in a variety of ways. The third is that to events which take place in an orderly manner, they assign causes which exhibit no order. Fourth, when they once understand how appearances come about, they think that they also have an understanding of the genesis of things which are not appearances, although, while it is possible that non-apparent things come to pass in a manner similar to appearances, perhaps they do not, but have their own peculiar way. Fifth, that almost all of them carry on their investigations into causes according to their own assumptions about the elements, rather than employing certain methods which are common to all and agreed upon. Sixth, that they often admit only facts which are discoverable in the light of their own peculiar assumptions, dismissing opposing facts, even those that possess equal probability. Seventh, that they often assign causes that conflict not only with appearances, but even with their own assumptions. Eighth, that when there are difficulties in the seemingly apparent things as well as in that which is the object of further search, the material out of which they construct their doctrines often shows difficulties equal to the difficulties of the things their doctrines are about." End quote. He then describes nearly every causal argument. Quote, "If for an apparent cause he assumes a cause which is apparent, or if for a non-evident cause he assumes one that is non-evident, he will be drawn out to infinity. And if he assumes one kind as the cause of the other, he will be reasoning in a circle. And if he stops anywhere, he will either say that the cause holds good as far as the circumstances of the present discussion go, thus introducing the relative and abolishing the absolute point of view, or else he will make some unwarranted assumption and be stopped on this score." End quote. He then explains a few of what he calls skeptical formulas. These are short sayings and phrases and terms that the skeptics used in those days. Of the term non-assertion, he says, quote, "Non-assertion is a state of mind we are in consequence of which we declare that we neither affirm nor deny anything." End quote. One of the most useful, I think, is "I suspend judgment." Something about the speed of the news cycle and social media makes us think that we have to have an opinion about everything and to have it quickly. This usually means our opinions are worthless because they are probably misinformed and incorrect, and if they are correct, it is only by chance, and using the same method, rapidly responding with whatever opinion comes to mind, we will likely be wrong next time, since this method will turn up a bad idea more often than a good one. He then says a bit about this formula, "I suspend judgment." Quote, "We use the formula I suspend judgment in lieu of I cannot say which of the objects presented I ought to believe and which I ought to disbelieve." End quote. He then says something similar on I determine nothing. Quote, "About the formula I determine nothing, we have the following to say. We believe that to determine means not simply to state something, but to bring forward and give assent to a view about a thing which is non-evident. My state of mind at the present is such that I make no dogmatic affirmation or denial of anything falling under the present investigation." End quote. He then describes a state of mind called indetermination. Quote, "Indetermination is a state of mind in which we neither deny nor affirm anything falling within the realm of dogmatic inquiry. I mean the realm of the non-evident." So when the skeptic says all things are undetermined, he takes the word "are" in the meaning that they appear so to him. By all things, he means not all existence, but such non-evident matters investigated by the dogmatists as he has examined. And by undetermined, he means they are not superior in the matter of credibility and incredibility to whatever is opposed to them or in general conflicts with them. It would be equivalent to saying, in all the investigations of the dogmatists I have come upon, their postulates appear to me to be such that none of them seems to be better, in point of credibility and incredibility, than that postulate which conflicts with it. End quote. He goes back to something he had said earlier, the matter of how, quote, "To every argument, an equal argument is opposed." End quote. He writes, quote, "In our statement, to every argument, an equal argument is opposed, the word every means every argument that we have examined. By argument, we mean not a simple statement, but the kind of statement which seeks to establish, in any way whatever, not necessarily by premises and conclusion, a point dogmatically, that is, some view touching on what is non-evident." End quote. So he specifies there that he's saying not all arguments, but arguments that seek to establish a point on what is not evident, have an equal opposing argument. Empiricus then answers those who say that skepticism is the same as the philosophy of the Cyrenaics, who were the predecessors of the Epicureans. He explains how skepticism differs from Cyrenaic philosophy. Quote, "Some assert that the Cyrenaic doctrine is identical with skepticism, since it too claims that states of mind are the only things that can be apprehended,
Nevertheless, it is different from skepticism. According to their doctrine, the end is pleasure and a smooth motion of the flesh, while for us it is mental tranquility, to which their end is in opposition. For whether pleasure is present or not, the person who positively maintains that pleasure is the end will have to submit to perturbations, as I have shown in the chapter on the end. Then again, we suspend judgment as to the essence of external objects, while the Cyrenaics make a declaration to the effect that their real nature is inapprehensible. End quote. This is an important difference between skeptic and academic philosophy. Today we use the word academic to mean relating to the university. Sometimes we use it pejoratively to mean tedious or pedantic or pointless. Empiricus emphasizes that the difference between academics and skeptics in the 2nd century meaning of the term is that academics say that external objects are inapprehensible, while skeptics do not pass judgment even on whether they are apprehensible or not. When you start to suggest suspending judgment on matters that are not absolutely clear, it may sometimes sound a little like verbal games where you have a sentence that sort of makes sense grammatically, but it does not track with anyone's actual experience of the world. Zeno's paradoxes are one example of this. There is first of all the one called the dichotomy, which states that to walk any distance, you must first walk half the distance, and to walk that half distance, you must walk half of that first, and so on ad infinitum. And you then have an infinite number of tasks to complete, which is impossible. Therefore, you cannot get there. The problem with this reasoning is that people walk all kinds of places all the time, so this is mostly a word game. There is a similar one about Achilles never being able to catch a tortoise because he always has to close the distance between him and the tortoise by half, and another about how an arrow in flight is never actually moving because at any given point it is only in one place. Empiricus gives some examples that are similar to this and says decisively that this is not what he is saying. Quote, in the case of sophisms, which might profitably require exposure, the dialectician will have nothing to say. The arguments he puts to us are like the following. If it is not so that you have shapely horns, and you have horns, you have horns. But it is not so that you have shapely horns and that you have horns. Therefore, you have horns. End quote. An aside here, no matter how many times I read that one, it doesn't even make sense in a weird philosophical way. This next one makes a little bit more sense in a stupid way. Quote, if anything moves, either it moves in the place where it is or where it is not, but it moves neither in the place where it is, for it would remain there, nor where it is not, for how could anything be active in a place where it does not even exist to begin with? Therefore, nothing moves. Either the existent becomes or the non-existent. Now, the existent does not become, for it exists, but neither does the non-existent. For whatever becomes undergoes something, but the non-existent does not undergo anything. Therefore, nothing becomes. Snow is frozen water, but water is black. Therefore, snow is black. And when he has made a collection of such claptrap as this, he knits his eyebrows, gets his dialectic ready, and undertakes very solemnly to prove to us by syllogistic demonstrations that something becomes, that something moves, that snow is white, and that we do not have horns. And yet it is probably sufficient to hold up against this stuff the palpable facts. Then a positive affirmation of any such nonsense will be shattered by the equally valid counter-evidence of appearances. And that is why a certain philosopher, when the argument against motion was put to him, without a word, proceeded to walk about. And people who follow the ordinary pursuits of life go on journeys by land and across the sea, and they build themselves ships and houses and beget children in neglect of the arguments against motion and becoming. There is also recorded an elegant little story by Pyrrhonism, the physician. This man was a contemporary of Diodorus, who showed his bad taste in dialectic by expounding sophistical arguments against motion and many other things as well. Once when Diodorus had dislocated his shoulder and had come to Herophilus to receive treatment, the latter said to him in jest, "Your shoulder has been dislocated either in the place where it was, or where it was not, but it has been dislocated neither where it was, nor where it was not. Therefore it has not been dislocated." So the sophist besought him to let such arguments be and apply the treatment suitable to him from the point of view of the medical art. For it is sufficient, I think, to pass one's life empirically and undogmatically, in accordance with the commonly accepted observances and preconceptions, suspending judgment about statements grounded on dogmatic subtlety and furthest removed from the business of life. End quote. So if anything that Empiricus said sounded like this kind of philosophical word game, then just know that he was stalwartly against that kind of pseudo-logic. And he always favored the weight of simple, clear evidence over
over-subtle reasoning. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you. All of this is detail and extrapolation on what I think is the main point, which I emphasized at the beginning of this podcast, which is that the skeptic is one who does not assent to what is not evident. This principle is easy to articulate and extremely difficult to apply consistently. In our minds, we have information from and about our environment that we have learned from our experience and from materials we have read and watched. If they are to be the basis of our factual view of the world, hopefully the most significant components here would be relevant and accurate statistics, the results of scientific experiments, historical information, photographs, and similar material. Unfortunately, less valid input, sometimes unintentionally but often delivered deliberately and with the explicit purpose of changing your thoughts about an aspect of your life, also influences almost everyone's worldview to varying degrees. These less valid or entirely invalid inputs include advertisements, irrelevant or selective news reports, newspaper editorials, certain films, social media posts, TV shows, documentaries, and books. A powerful practice for trying to hold fast to what is true is to ensure that all of your thoughts about the world track closely with only valid inputs. That is, assent to nothing but what the relevant facts demonstrate. This is complicated by the fact that we are often not even aware of what it is we are assenting to. Sometimes the statement to which you are assenting without evidence is never even spoken aloud. The statement might be, for example, if elected, this political candidate will apply policies that will improve the circumstances of my life in some way. What evidence do you have for that? What evidence do you have that supports the opposite position? Is your perception of the situation being affected by something irrelevant, like your desire for a particular outcome? Or, to give another example, the statement might be, owning this product will satisfy me spiritually and/or existentially. On what basis do you think this is true? How likely is it that there is some secondary reason that you want this to be true, or are chemically primed, or indeed have been actively and intentionally persuaded or even deceived to think that it is true? Something in my genetics, in my upbringing, in my culture, makes me loath to proselytize. It seems that it is not at all my right to recommend to anyone a particular course of action or a particular thought. For me to have my own views is of course valid, but to encourage others in any particular direction seems to be overstepping the bounds of propriety and good manners. However, I can say that if your goal is to do good, high-quality thinking, this must be the direction in which to go. Human cognition has the potential to improve life for humans and animals, to make it easier, more enjoyable, and more meaningful. For the other animals, it can at least make it easier and more enjoyable, if not more meaningful. Human cognition also has the potential to vitiate life, to debase it, to make it dull, boring, difficult, and in the extreme, infernal. Here, Empiricus has given us an excellent perspective and position from which we can best and most effectively approach the questions in our daily life. Most people have a basic assumption that to know the truth and act according to it is preferable to either being deceived or to know the truth and act according to a falsehood. The skeptical approach to knowledge, that is, assenting only to what is evident, loyally maintained with vigilance and discipline, will reliably keep your thoughts and words, and by extension your actions, as close to what is true as any mode of thinking can. The reason this mode of thinking is so powerful is it describes clearly and quickly the specific action, the mechanism by which to ensure that while in your mind you have your information about the world on one side and your thoughts about it on the other, the latter does not drift too far from the former. If you were to swing an axe to cut firewood or discharge a firearm at a target, you would do so carefully. You would want to know exactly what the object, the target of your action was, because if you were mistaken about this, you could accidentally kill somebody. I posit that you should be as cautious about assenting to almost anything, or at least anything of consequence, as you would be about swinging an axe or firing a weapon, for exactly the same reason. Ideas affect our society, often in ways that are not obvious, and they get people killed all the time, and they only gain momentum and power because people assent to them, because you assent to them. The only chance we have of avoiding disaster is adhering strictly to what we clearly know to be true. Intellectual honesty means applying this principle ruthlessly and relentlessly to all claims one encounters, no matter from where those claims emanate, and following the principle to whatever conclusions it leads, without any a priori assumptions, and whatever the social or political implications of those conclusions may be. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope that you will send the link to it to the readers in your life, and that you will buy some books for yourself, your family, and your friends from volrathpublishing.com. That's VOLLRATH publishing.com. As I'm making this recording in early 2023, I've only published one book, and that is an edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
but I have big plans for what is coming next, so if you want to help to invigorate, to strengthen, to energize, to celebrate, to honor, to steward the European literary canon, by means of the printing of new high-quality editions of these classic works with the specially commissioned cover art that they deserve and carefully prepared footnotes that accelerate the flow of reading all for a good price, go order a copy right now for yourself and for the readers you know. With your support and love for and understanding of the true value of classic literature, combined with my knowledge of publishing, we can print a whole library of new editions of classic works, both famous and forgotten. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.